Good morning, and thank you for joining us for another in our series of online programs. My name is Patrice Weaver, and I am the Education Programs Manager at the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust. The Commission is a secular, nonpartisan state agency that strives to preserve the memory of the Holocaust and promote public understanding of the history. We're going to continue with our series called The Longest Hatred, a look at historic anti-Semitism today. And we're going to start in the Rhineland. So just over 200 years after the People's Crusade slaughtered thousands of Jews here, another wave of persecution arrived. Jews in the Franconia region had historically enjoyed protection by German rulers, but the combination of accelerating anti-Jewish sentiment and deteriorating political authority allowed the barely contained anti-Semitic feelings of the populace to boil over. Christians rose up after hearing talk of the Jews stealing a communion wafer and defiling it out of anti-Christian sentiment. Like the blood libel charges in which Jews allegedly killed a Christian child to drain his blood and use it to make Passover matzah, host desecration attributed a no less bizarre crime to Jews: the purchase or theft of communion wafers in order to abuse and torture them. Now, communion or Eucharist wafers are considered by Roman Catholics to be the equivalent to the body of Christ. Hence, the desecration or abuse of the wafer is considered torture and equivalent to a repeat of the crucifixion of Jesus. This was viewed as a capital blasphemy that was a key element of medieval Christian theology regarding Jews. On Sunday, April 20th, 1298, 2 weeks after Easter, 21 Jews were attacked and burned alive by a mob led by a man named Rhineland. He urged revenge for the alleged desecration of the host and subsequently took a mob from town to annihilate Jews. This man, Rhineland, claimed to have received a mandate from heaven to avenge the sacrilege and exterminate the Jews. By the way, his name translates to beef in English, meaning he was probably a butcher by trade. Now, a wave of massacres swept through Franconia, Swabia, Hesse, and Thuringia. The Nuremberg Chronicles at the time lists 146 individual communities where attacks took place and lists the names of over 5,000 Jews who were killed. The mob traveled throughout Bavaria until at least late 1303. And remember, this started in the spring of 1298. There were a number of chronicles at the time that noted the slayings, and it is estimated that about 20,000 men, women, and children were murdered. The next big benchmark in historic anti-Semitism is the Black Death. In 1347, an illness began spreading inland from the port cities in Italy. Today, we refer to this as the Black Death or the Black Plague. We now know that the Black Death is spread by a bacillus and that it can travel from person to person through the air as well as through the bite of infected fleas or lice. Both of these pests were found almost everywhere in medieval Europe, but they were particularly at home aboard ships of all kinds. This explains how the deadly plague made its way through one European city to another. Now, in an age when people looked for God's hand in literally everything, many saw the Black Death as punishment for mankind's sins. Other people had another theory. You guessed it, the Jews did it. In 1348, a group of Jews from Geneva confessed, under imprisonment and torture, to having poisoned wells across Europe. This event kicked off a rampage of killing Jews in France, Belgium, Spain, Switzerland, and Germany. Many mobs simply attacked Jewish districts, killing everyone they could find. Along with general anti-Semitism, however, it is possible that people blamed the Jews because they seemed immune to the Black Death. Now, some historians believe that along with Jewish hygiene customs, being ostracized and keeping within their prescribed areas meant that many Jews were effectively quarantined. As the plague ran its course, surviving Jews remained in Europe. As one generation yielded to the next, the horrors of the Black Death became a marker in the historic memory of Jewish persecutions. Now, in England, Jews were not blamed for the Black Death for the simple reason that there weren't any Jews left in the country. King Edward I had issued his Edict of Expulsion in 1290, banishing all the Jews from England. He'd been busily persecuting them for over a decade because the crown was in debt to Jewish moneylenders, and executing these Jewish criminals was an easy way to curry favor with his people. Expelling them meant that he could steal their property. England was only one of many European countries to expel its entire Jewish community on numerous occasions. For example, France expelled and recalled its Jewish population repeatedly. King Philip the Fair expelled them in 1306 because he, you guessed it, needed money to fight the Flemish, which he of course raised by confiscating Jewish property. Sadly, many of the Jews expelled by Philip had only come to France after being banished from England in 1290. Now, Philip's successor recalled the Jews after about 9 years because the Christians who took over the money lending industry recovered debts with what was deemed to be intolerable cruelty. Many individual cities as well as countries followed suit, either when debts to English moneylenders or Jewish moneylenders became too high or anti-Semitic feelings could not be contained. Now, this history of continual expulsion and removal helped give rise to what is called the legend of the Wandering Jew. The Wandering Jew is a mythical, immortal man whose story began to spread in Europe during the 12th century. The original legend concerns a Jew who taunted Jesus on his way to the crucifixion and was then cursed to walk the earth until the second coming. This legend or story of the Wandering Jew became a symbol for all Jews that were forced to move from place to place seeking safety. This legend certainly has legs, no pun intended. As recently as 1868, the Deseret News of Salt Lake City reported on the appearance of the immortal man in downtown New York. If you would like to know more about this legend, please email me and I will send you the link to a site managed by the University of Pittsburgh that maintains a list of these stories and legends from around Europe and America. We next travel to beautiful Vienna, Austria. Now, the beautiful facade of the city belies some really troubling history. For centuries, Jewish life in Vienna flowered around the Jewish square or the Judenplatz district. Within this area was an important synagogue, school, hospital, and bathhouse. Despite sporadic persecutions, the Viennese Jews were left relatively unmolested. That is, until Archduke Albert V came along. He first taxed them heavily to fund his part in the Hussite Wars. Then he blamed them for collaborating with the enemy after his sound defeat. Slanderous accusations of host desecration gave him ammunition for the inevitable. In May of 1420, Albert set about the Vienna Gazzara, or persecutions. He arrested wealthy Jews, and he sent the poor down the Danube on rudderless vessels. He stole their property. He tricked children into eating non-kosher foods. He tortured and executed them. After Albert suffered another humiliating defeat in war, he returned to Vienna to take his anger out on the Jews that were still imprisoned. He tried to force them to convert through torture, causing a mass suicide. This infuriated Albert at what he perceived was their disobedience to his orders. He then rounded up the 200 plus survivors, took them to the outskirts of the city, and had them burned alive for their crimes. So now we go to Spain. How many of you remember this? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, something else happened in 1492. That was the year that the joint Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, completed the reconquest of Spain from the Moors. Shortly after the capture of the last Moorish stronghold of Granada, Isabella and Ferdinand issued the Alhambra Decree, which ordered the expulsion of practicing Jews from their kingdom. Now, Jews had lived on the Iberian Peninsula for more than 1,700 years, producing philosophers, poets, diplomats, physicians, scholars, and merchants. After the decree was passed, Spain's entire Jewish population was given 4 months to either convert to Christianity or leave the country. Now, they were permitted to take their belongings with them, excluding, and I quote, gold or silver or minted money or other things prohibited by the laws of our kingdom, end quote. In other words, anything of value. The Jews had to sell everything they could not carry, their land, their houses, their libraries. Now, converting their wealth to a more portable form proved difficult. Imagine, the market in Spain was saturated with these goods, which meant that the prices were artificially lowered. As a result, much of the wealth of the Jewish community remained in Spain. The punishment for any Jew who did not convert or leave by the deadline was summary execution. Now, prior to the Reconquest, a majority of Spain's Jewish population had already converted to Christianity due to ongoing persecutions, violence, and restrictions of things like where they could live or the kind of work they could do. According to one noted historian, Joseph Perez, there were as many as 200,000 of these converts. Now, these people came to be known as conversos or marranos. At the time of the expulsion, the tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition had been invited by the king and queen to come to Spain. Its purpose was to help identify heretics among those who converted and to root out secret or crypto Jews who practice or continue to practice Judaism underground. Although Judaism was not considered a heresy, professing Christianity while engaging in Jewish practices was heretical. Additionally, there were statutes called the limpieza de sangre, meaning in English, cleanness or purity of blood. These laws instituted legal discriminations against converso descendants, barring them from certain positions and forbidding them from immigrating to the Americas. Now remember, this started in 1492 with Columbus sailing. So all of the other conquistadores and the like who went to the New World were starting to establish it and extract the wealth of the New World and bring it back to Spain. But descendants of conversos were not allowed to participate in that. So it's interesting to me that the Inquisition was not abolished in Spain until 1834. So let's take a little closer look at the images on this slide. First of all, in the lower right-hand corner, you see a picture of the actual Alhambra decree signed by Isabella and Ferdinand. The engraving to the left of it are the kinds of tortures that were suffered by the victims of the Inquisition. And again, if you're tortured, you're gonna pretty much confess to anything, right? Above it, above the Alhambra decree, is a painting of an auto de fe. Now the auto de fe translates to act of faith, and that was the name of the public ceremony held during the Inquisition when convicted heretics were sentenced and executed. Now let's look at the last image on this page, the painting. It's entitled The Expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and it was done by an artist named Solomon Hart. Now what we're looking at here is our Spanish Jews kneeling before King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella while the Grand Inquisitor Tomás de Torquemada argues for their expulsion from Spain. Interesting thing to note about Solomon Hart is that he was the first Jewish member of the Royal Academy in London and was probably the most important Jewish artist working in England in the 19th century. So a little extra word about Torquemada. He was a he was a Castilian Dominican friar and the religious confessor to the king and queen. Because of his extreme religious zeal, he was named the first Grand Inquisitor of the Inquisition. Interestingly, Torquemada came from a family of conversos, and during his time as Grand Inquisitor, he was responsible for the brutal deaths of over 2,000 people. So now let's look at a map showing the migrations and settlement of Spanish Jews. You can see they were dispersed throughout the world. An interesting thing happened in 2015. The Spanish Parliament sought to make amends by offering Spanish citizenship to the descendants of these expelled Jews. Without a dissenting vote, it enacted a law inviting the Sephardim Jews who traced their roots to Spain to return. The law declared that after, quote, centuries of estrangement, Spain now welcomes Sephardic communities to re-encounter their origins, opening forever the doors of their homeland of old, end quote. At the time the offer expired in 2019, 120,000 people had applied. So now, leaving Spain and the Inquisition, let's move into the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation. What we're looking at here is a picture of Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther was a German Augustinian monk who kicked off the Protestant Reformation in 1517 when he nailed his 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, which is a small university town in Saxony, Germany. A note, if you remember last time we talked about the carvings of the Judensaal that were placed up on the wall of a church in Wittenberg, that was St. Mary's Church, and where he nailed his 95 Theses was on the Castle Church. Same town, different churches, but no doubt Luther was very familiar with that carving of the Judensaal. So Luther started out as a supporter of Jewish people, arguing quite rightly that they had been badly treated by the Roman Catholic Church, and quite wrongly that if presented with what he regarded as a more authentic Christianity, they would surely convert. In 1523, he wrote an essay entitled, "That Jesus Was Born a Jew," condemning the fact that the church had dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else than deride them and seize their property. No kidding, Martin Luther, no kidding. But the Jews did not convert, and Luther reacted appallingly. In 1543, he published The Jews and Their Lies, which today is shocking in its venom. Even for its time, it stood out with particularly cruel and intolerant. In the 65,000-word treatise, Luther calls for a litany of horrors, including the destruction of synagogues, Jewish schools and homes, for rabbis to be forbidden to preach, for the stripping of legal protections for Jews, and for, yes, of course, here it comes, the confiscation of their assets. The Jews are, quote, wrote Luther, and I quote, a base, whoring people, that is, no people of God, and their boast of lineage, circumcision, and law must be accounted as filth, end quote. It wasn't until the 1990s that the various Lutheran church branches began to publicly disavow Luther's anti-Semitic writings. Now we're going to move our attention south into beautiful Italy. Established by decree of the Doge, the chief magistrate of the Venetian Republic, on March 29, 1516, the Venice Ghetto was one of the first places where people were forcibly segregated because of religious difference. The term itself originated here. The area that had been used as a foundry or a ghetto in the Venetian dialect, and over time, the neighborhood's polyglot residents corrupted the word to ghetto. The Venetian government allowed Jewish residents to engage in restricted trades such as money lending, pawnbroking, and secondhand clothing sales outside of the segregated spaces during the daytime. At night, the gates that surrounded the Venetian ghetto were locked and guarded. Now, despite the seclusion of the Venetian ghetto, over time it became a thriving cultural hub. Here were many early Hebrew books first published, including the Hebrew Bible and the Babylonian Talmud. In fact, nearly a third of Hebrew books printed in Europe before 1650 were printed in Venice. When the ghetto was at its height in the 17th century, 5,000 Jews from Italy, Germany, France, Spain, and the Ottoman Empire carved out tiny, distinct neighborhoods, each maintaining its own synagogue, all of them crammed within an acre and a quarter of alleys and courtyards. Confinement surely was a burden, but it also provided an opportunity for cultural exchange unparalleled in the diaspora. And you can see from this picture here, this is a map of the ghetto from the 16th century, and you can see the wall that surrounds the entire area. You can get a sense of just how small that really was. Now, the ghetto lasted until the fall of the Venetian Republic in 1797. Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Venice and decreed the end of Jewish segregation. He removed the gates of the ghetto and equalized citizen rights for all Jews. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about today is Elizabethan literature. Now, although Jews remained exiled from England during the Elizabethan period, the country was still rampantly anti-Semitic. The English author and Protestant preacher John Foxe complained of the heinous abominations, insatiable butcheries, treasons, frenzies, and madness of Jewish people in 1577. Now, Foxe is best remembered for his The Book of Martyrs about the sufferings of Protestants under the Catholic Church. Elizabethan theater capitalized on the public's anti-Semitism by producing some truly odious works. In 1589, the dramatist Christopher Marlowe wrote a tragedy called The Jew of Malta. And this was about a treacherous and mass-murdering Jewish usurer named Barabbas who meddles in a Christian-Islamic conflict and is boiled alive at the poem's triumphant climax. Now, Shakespeare's contribution to anti-Semitic drama is probably the most well-known of these three. The Merchant of Venice, it's actually more problematic than the others as well. The titular merchant, Shylock, is a Jewish usurer, and debate still rages among Shakespearean scholars about the bard's view of Jews, for Shylock has some truly sympathetic moments. Shylock says he hates Christians because they hate him. Could this be Shakespeare offering a rather modern view of the treatment of Jews? Either way, the inclusion of a Jewish bad guy was a guarantee of big audiences, especially after the execution of one Dr. Rodrigo Lopez, a converted Portuguese Jew who had been Queen Elizabeth's personal physician. He was charged with allegedly plotting against her life and was executed publicly. And this all happened just before Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice. Now, all of these works are still in print and very well known. And just again, as a little aside, I grew up with a copy of Foxe's The Book of Martyrs on our bookshelf right next to a King James version of the Bible. So that brings us to an end of this week's talk. Again, if you have suggestions about today's presentation or would like to suggest future topics, please email me at patriceweaver@holocaust.georgia.gov. We are constantly looking to improve our presentations, and I welcome your feedback. Thank you very much for joining us today.